Okay, so thank you, Greg. As usual, it's very enlightening to hear you, so thank you. My name is Thibaut, for those of you who don't know me, and I am the co-founder of the Vintage Report. And so today, essentially, it's very nice to have Greg opening because I'm going to try to dissect, by looking more locally, how the climate parameters are affecting the plant physiological parameters, which in turn are driving the fruit compositional parameters. So in order to go into that in-depth analysis, I propose to walk you through this morning through the 4 different steps. So first, I'd like to take one step back, and I will discuss for over 5 or 6 slides what is the framework within which we can analyze how the sequences of climatic periods, the sequences of environmental stresses experienced by the plant are setting up the stage for the fruit ripening patterns to be the way it is eventually observed towards the end of the season. So in order to do that, I'm going to define 5 periods, and then we will look specifically at how climatic parameters, plant parameters, and fruit parameters are trending within each period to try to build an understanding of what is the cause-consequence relationship existing between climate, plant, and eventually fruit. So how are we going to do that? Well, essentially, if you're looking on a horizontal axis, you see different stages. At bud burst, we enter into what I call the stage number 2, which lasts until maximum shoot length is reached, because by then it will define the highest vine water needs. Then we enter into period 3, during which the footprint of environmental stresses will be perceived by the plant with a carryover effect onto the fruit chemical composition. So this stage ends at veraison, and then we enter into stage 4. During stage 4, we are actually seeing that fruit is actively loading sugar up until a specific stage when sugars is no longer actively loading into the fruit. That marks the end of primary metabolites accumulating into the pulp, and this is the end of stage 4. And then stage 5 is really the last stages during which skin composition keeps varying. It is during that stage that we observe the peak of color accumulation, and this stage is final at harvest. And then we enter into stage 1 again, which starts at leaf fall and which ends next year at bud break. So what I have done is looking extensively at the literature to help being guided when building an understanding of how period 1, 2, 3 perceived at a plant and measured at a climatic level will have a carryover effect onto berry composition as it is being measured during period 4 and 5. So with that understanding in mind, I'm going to slice climatic parameters first along the season. And what's very interesting is that it's not to say that there is a silver bullet, given value that is the golden standards. Actually, more than looking at values per se, it's very interesting to look at the time trajectories. And that's true for any biological indices. And to some extent, it's also true, as much as we can understand, with climatic parameters. So when I say time trajectories right now, I'm roughly dividing it into 5 periods, but we will see within each period how we observe the behavior of specific values being an indication of their consequences on fruit. How, for instance, can we build that kind of understanding? So here I have overlaid under this 5-stage axis the main climatic parameters that are known to have an effect on plant parameters. So rain, for instance, will be the key factors in California because we are typically operating at, compared to other wine-growing regions, relatively high temperature. So I will focus on rain during period 1. Then during period 2, because temperature accumulation and rain are driving the speed of shoot elongation, it's very nice to try to find any potential correlations between shoot elongation speed and rain and heat accumulation, here growing degree days. And that goes on until after the maximum crop coefficient value has been reached. Temperature, vapor pressure deficit, and light are also starting to play a key role into setting up the stage for the chemical composition of the berries, particularly from berry set on. Then if you try to translate the footprint of those blue parameters onto the green, onto the plant parameters, well, those are the parameters that we should look at prior to bud break, having an idea of the bud fertility, having an idea of the amount of wood reserve, because that sets the stage for the yield potential. We'll discuss that briefly. I haven't so much spent time on bud fertility for this year. Then period 2, this is the period during which nitrogen is actively accumulated into the plant tissue, and this is the period during which shoot elongation occurs. And that sets the stage for period 3, during which nitrogen uptake reaches its maximal value that we will analyze. The severity of water deficit during period 3 will set the stage for maximum berry weight and also for aromatic precursors and flavonoid precursors. And then it's the stage during which we can get a handle on cluster count. During the second part of the season, which will be the second part of this morning conference, we will look at how rain, temperature, and VPD are affecting the level of vine water deficit, and then how is that driving the yield component, such as maximum volume per berry, such as maximal amount of sugar per berry, and towards period 5, since that's when the skin composition reaches its highest level in, say, anthocyanin concentration, we look at the trends in those flavonoids compounds. So now let's dive in the nitty-gritty. The next slide will focus on temperature accumulation. I kept the blue for 2016, orange for last year, and 18 in black. The long story short here, what I like to look at is the last column in 2017 shows that we had only 110 millimeters of water during the winter. And then if you merge that with the first column on your left, on 2018, 120. So you see we had under 300 millimeters, we had, sorry, under 200 growing degree days of accumulation, which is more than what we had observed in the past. So essentially, we can conclude from that quick heat accumulation analysis that we had a warm winter. However, period 2 was cooler. Period 3 was similar to average, but period 4 was also cooler. And period 5 was also 80 degrees day cooler than 2017. So we will see how this pattern of heat accumulation affected the fruit ripening kinetics later on. So check heat accumulation. Now let's check rain. And what are we going to try to extract from our analysis of rain? We are going to try to second guess and anticipate the earliness of water deficit. The duration of shoot elongation. Is the maximum vine water need reached earlier or later? And if it's later, like it was in 2018, how much later? And we are also going to try to put in parallel the amount of rain with the timing of the highest nitrogen content per tissue. We are also going to use rain as a proxy to explain variations in water deficit index. And also it's a nice info to have in order to explain why spatial contrast in your aerial picture, for instance, is boosted. We know that under drier year, we have more spatial contrast between heterogeneous areas of your vineyard. But it's also useful to interpret fruit parameter, the value of the maximum volume per berry, the value of the alcohol potential after sugar stopped loading actively, or also the timing of when the berry stops to be calling for sugar. All of that is partially under the amount of rain. So doing exactly the same exercise, looking at the last orange column on your right and the first on your left, you see that we had less than 300 millimeter on average in Napa Valley. So what I have forgot to say that those charts come from the statistical analysis of the extensive network of weather stations we have. So each number is actually the mean of many weather stations, so that we get an idea of what is the statistical trend from north to south Napa Valley. Under 300 millimeter of water before bud break. This is very different from 2016, where we had around 535 millimeter before bud break, and more than 700 millimeter before 2017. Where am I going there? Well, with this low amount of winter rain before the bud break in 2018, maybe we have an early indication that the amount of nitrogen that's going to be plant available might be lessened, simply because with less moisture content, we have less microbiological activity. And we will see whether or not this was perceived by the plant, and we will discuss the implication that it can have for 2018, but also for 2019. Interestingly, we had more rain during the period of shoot elongation. That may have an impact on the leaf area size, therefore on the amount of water the plant needs from one day to the next. Also, having more rain during the growth may postpone the onset of the first water deficit, with consequences on the fruit composition. Now let's look at the vapor pressure deficit. I'm going to spend a bit time on this specific climate value because it's underrated and it has a key role into driving the water out of the plant into the atmosphere. So the vapor pressure deficit is essentially the amount of pressure you need to apply to 1 unit of air volume, pressure to apply to see appear the first droplet of liquid water. So the greater is this pressure, the more likely the air is going to dry water from any surface. So you can assimilate vapor pressure deficit as the draw that the air is having to remove water from plant water tissue content. Why is that important? Well, because it drives, just like the sun, the daily amount of plant water needs. A reduction in the value of the maximum water needs will be seen in response to high vapor pressure deficit. So the severity of the heat wave, which will be quantified in terms of kilopascal, so 4 kilopascal is, we're starting to get into a heat wave, 5 it's very bad, and when you start getting over those numbers, the water column within the plant breaks down. It breaks down and an air bubble pops in. And those air bubbles are just acting as corks that are preventing the flow of water from going freely from the roots through the plant and then to be vaporized into the atmosphere. So if you have less water flow going out, you are also likely to have less carbon flow going in, with consequences on carbohydrates, on secondary metabolite compounds. Therefore, the very quality of the food production may be impacted by those heat waves. It's also very important to be critically assessing how effective is your irrigation. For instance, the duration effect of an irrigation will be shortened if you have to go through more heat waves. The rate at which the level of vine water need satisfaction decline will be also sped up by VPD. Fruit parameters, how are they linked with VPD? Well, they are linked because once you've reached the maximum amount of sugar per berry, the berry is not so intimately connected, hydraulically speaking, with the plant. Therefore, it still listens to the plant water tissue content, but the berry is also listening a lot and a lot more to vapor pressure deficit variations. So at this stage, the berry synthesizes both signals. One signal of water deficit coming from the plant, and another signal coming from the water deficit of the atmosphere. So the VPD will translate into berry size variations and, more importantly, volume loss. Remember last year we observed up to 20% of berry volume loss in response to VPD. That's not because we were not doing a good job with irrigation, it was just atmosphere draw of water. So what's the situation? Well, compared to the mean, essentially the situation, as Greg was saying, was relatively moderate. You see that the value compared to last year during period 4 were lower. So instead of having, on average, the maximum value of vapor pressure deficit, which is reached between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m., on average, it dropped down from 3.4 kilopascal to 3.1. During period 5, which is the most sensitive period where berry weight variations, berry volume variations responds to VPD, we see a drop of 3.3 to 2.8. So you see those conditions were more propitious to maintain berry volume to its highest value. And if we look at the number of days where I have set up arbitrarily a heat wave day whenever the maximum vapor pressure deficit of the day reaches 4 kilopascal or over, we see that we had fewer of those days with a lower average value of VPD during those days. So the stage here is set to have the climate playing in favor of long maturation cycle. Why? Because on average, the peak VPD is low, 3.15. We had more heat wave days than last year for a lower average VPD. So in other words, even when we had a heat wave, it was less brutal, it was less severe, because they have been spread over more days. And during period 5, it's even better. We have even lower value of VPD max. All of that is conducive to favoring long hang time and to achieve systematically complete ripening, even if sites that suffered no water deficit, because you can afford to leave the fruit longer. The climate is not playing against you. To conclude, let's look at temperatures. And temperatures are useful to interpret the timing of phenological events, but if we look more as if the plant was a factory, high temperature may reduce the efficiency of photosynthesis activity. So we have threshold at 35, 42 degrees Celsius. Then even tissue necrosis is likely to respond to different temperature before or after veraison. So we look at those numbers in terms of maximum temperatures. There is also, the Portuguese have led some interesting work on that, a synergistic effect between water stress, worsening even at moderate level the negative impact of high temperature. So a temperature that will go unnoticed by the plant may become noticeable if water deficit exacerbates the sensitivity of the plants to this threshold temperature. It's around 35, 36. High minimum temperature, which are met during the night, are also contributing to the flow of water leaving the plant. In other words, when you are in slopes or in vineyard situation where at night temperature does not drop below 14 Celsius like we see very regularly in Paso Robles, the plant is losing water. It's not losing water in exchange of trading it with carbon, it's just losing water. So the root reservoir, in terms of water, depletes itself faster when minimum temperature gets higher, and it precipitates the water deficit. So what's the situation if we look at minimum temperature? Well, it's mirroring what Greg has seen on a global scale. We see that minimum temperature all along the year have been lower. This is something that we can take as an indication that the amount of water lost by the plants during the night may be less, which favors very low water deficit index periods, less water stress. So that's what I have summarized here. The minimum temperature shows that it has been less likely to observe nighttime water loss. And this is also a good thing to maintain good and smooth sugar ripening conditions during period 4. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum, maximum temperature during period 2, 3, and 4, and 5. Well, it's the same idea. In fact, when we look at numbers, it's particularly lower during period 4 and 5, on average 1.4 degrees Celsius. This is good compared to last year. It means less color degradation. It means less stop and going during sugar ripening. You remember last year around Labor Day weekend, we had this major halt on all sugar loading curves. Well, this year, those atmospheric conditions should not let that happen. To keep a grain of salt, of course, local variations do occur. I have mentioned topography. So you need to look at your site specifically, but those are the general trends within Napa. So now that we have understood a little bit how the climate is talking to the plant, let's look at how the plant is translating these stresses. In order to do that, I'm going to look at two indices before the next talk. One index is the nitrogen biological index, and the other one will be the maximum basal crop coefficient. The nitrogen biological index is a way to monitor non-destructively by using light how much nitrogen is accumulating within the leaf tissue. So what we can do, all of a sudden, instead of having a destructive sample, we can monitor the speed at which nitrogen accumulates, when the peak is being reached, and what is the value of nitrogen tissue content when that peak is reached. And from there, we can derive a better management of the fertilization program. So, in essence, NBI index is useful to interpret the timing of the peak nitrogen uptake, and that is in turn useful to improve the fertilization practice. Why is that important? Well, because nitrogen has a key role into orchestrating the photosynthetic activity. Typically, it's also very interesting, particularly in the context of California, to look at nitrogen deficit separately from water deficit. And we'll see why this is very relevant, particularly in 2018. But if we observe no water stress, but nitrogen stress at the same time, then probably the best way to mitigate the nitrogen deficit is not through irrigation, but rather through canopy spray. In terms of fruit parameter, well, nitrogen is involved in yeast assimilable nitrogen and some aromatic compounds. And very importantly, nitrogen deficit year N will impact yield during year N+1. Just as a reminder, 2014 we had a very low nitrogen uptake, 2015 we had lower yield. So if we observe lower than usual nitrogen level, it is possible to anticipate lower yield potential the year after. And what did we observe? Here I have reported for many sites segregated by varietals what is the peak value of nitrogen. And you see that the trend for Cabernet, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Chardonnay is the same. Everywhere we have observed a collapse of the highest value of nitrogen tissue content. So the amount of nitrogen per leaf area has been lowered. The date when that stage is reached, however, wasn't easily characterized, except that it happened before middle of June. So depending upon the varietal, the highest amount of nitrogen is reached between June 3rd and June 15. Okay, what can we make out of that? Well, we can say two things. First, this year we've observed less nitrogen per leaf area. And the peak nitrogen has been reached early. So I can ask two questions. Is this lower level of nitrogen the reflection of less rain during the winter, during period 1 and 2? Has it been exacerbated by the fact that leaf area development lasted until after the peak of nitrogen has been reached, therefore being favorable to the dilution of a given amount of nitrogen into more biomass? So the conclusion so far is that nitrogen has been trending low, and that's when I started to look at who were the researchers likely to come to Napa Valley to speak about nitrogen deficit. It's a vintage threat. We've been observing it everywhere, and not only in Napa, actually. It's also in Sonoma and in Paso. The take-home is that in the future, if we have the same level of erratic conditions during the rain supply in the winter, it might be very relevant to start tracking nitrogen uptake independently from water uptake. And it's also probably interesting on your specific site to try to see whether or not there is a correlation between rain and temperature during period 1 and 2. Now I'd like to discuss our observations regarding the maximum value of plant basal crop coefficient. So the higher is that number for a given climatic demand, the more water the plant needs to satisfy fully its water needs. When the value is higher, we therefore have higher than water needs. It's also interesting because by looking specifically at the plant, we are not confusing the effect and the contribution of soil transpiration and cover crop transpiration at boosting the amount of water being lost by the vineyard. It's also interesting to look at when this value is being reached, because as long as this value is still growing, there is no water stress. So the timing of KCB max is an indication of the first onset of water deficit. And we'll see that it has a very strong impact in Napa. It's also useful to assess the efficiency of your irrigation. A good irrigation should bring back the plant to its maximal level of water use. The maximal level of water use being indicated by how much water is flowing through the plant. If you don't reach that flow of water into the plant following an irrigation, it's probably that your irrigation wasn't as efficient as it could be. In other words, you could have applied more water to force the root reservoir to really be completely saturated and therefore transpiring more. So, in other words, if you do achieve peak transpiration after an irrigation at its maximum level, then you've probably optimized your irrigation strategy. If you haven't, maybe you could look at a way to slightly increase your water volume, because then you will get more effect, duration, and a better water use efficiency following that irrigation. In terms of yield, what can we derive from high KCB value? There are some reports in the literature showing that a higher KCB max is sometimes related to higher yield. I'm thinking of Knipfer in 2018 in a Northern California vineyard. He showed that nicely. But it's not always true. It's not true with Pinot Noir. With some clone of Cabernet Sauvignon, we've seen that there was decoupling between KCB max and yield. So we have to take that measurement with a grain of salt. And what's the picture? Well, the picture is really self-explanatory. Over the last 3 years, monitoring KCB max has shown a huge difference. The footprint of 2018 here is very blatant. You see that KCB max is being reached 4 to 5 weeks later for those 3 different varietals. And again, we measure that by looking at the flow of water inside the plant and when it tips and when it reaches its maximum value. So the consequence of the delayed timing of KCB max are at least divided into those 3 bullet points. Maximal vine water use is reached later, water deficit will appear later. And we are talking about 4 weeks. We'll see that at the fruit level, this will have an effect. This also suggests that there is a potential for nitrogen dilution. So not only do we have the rain during period 1 and 2 as a potential explanation for why we see low nitrogen, but there was this extra length of time during which nitrogen was no longer actively uptaken, but the biomass of the plant was still growing. So the potential for nitrogen dilution was there. And it sets also the stage for maximum berry volume. We will see to which extent this has been observed this year. So with that context in mind, we have this very unique situation where the stage is set to have a low water deficit during nitrogen uptake, but still we have nitrogen deficit. It's a unique situation. If you look at the literature, everywhere it's written that nitrogen deficit and water deficit are intertwined. There is few work looking specifically at nitrogen deficit effect regardless of water deficit variations or vigor variations. But there is an original work that has been done by Pierre, who is going to come now, to analyze the single effect of nitrogen deficit regardless of vigor variations or water deficit variations. And it might be a situation that's recurring in California, so that's why I thought it was going to be relevant to invite Pierre on stage and have him share with us his results.